The glass door of Mike's diner flew open, letting in a blast of freezing air that made everyone look up. Sarah Miller hugged her thin jacket tighter as she stepped inside, shoulders hunched against the bitter January cold. Her breath came out in white puffs that slowly faded as the warmth of the diner enveloped her. "You're late again?" barked Frank, the cook, without looking up from the grill. "Sorry," Sarah called back, rushing to tie her apron behind the counter. "Bus broke down halfway here. Get ready. You think you know where this story is going. But trust me, you don't. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel." Her fingers, still numb from the cold, fumbled with the strings. At 34, Sarah's hands showed the early signs of her hard life. Slight calluses, a small burn scar from the coffee maker, and nails cut short for practicality. There was nothing fancy about Sarah Miller, from her practical ponytail to her worn sneakers. But her eyes, warm brown and kind, still held a spark that life hadn't managed to extinguish. "Table 5's been waiting 10 minutes, said Doris, the other waitress, sliding past with 3 plates balanced expertly on her arm. "And your regulars already at the counter." Sarah glanced toward the counter and felt a genuine smile spread across her face. There sat Nathan, a retired high school teacher who came in every morning at 8:15 for 2 eggs over easy and wheat toast. The predictability of his visits had become a comforting constant in her chaotic life. "Morning, Nathan," Sarah said, pouring him a cup of coffee without asking. "The usual?" "You know it," he replied with a wink. "How's Tommy doing? Any news?" The smile faltered on Sarah's face, but she quickly recovered. "Doctor appointment this afternoon. They're trying a new combination of medications." What she didn't say was how her 19-year-old brother's leukemia treatment was draining what little savings she had, how she'd been taking double shifts for months, or how the latest hospital bill had arrived yesterday with a number so large it seemed made up. These were burdens she carried silently, like the persistent ache in her lower back from standing 12 hours a day. "I'll be keeping him in my thoughts," Nathan said, his weathered face softening. "That boy's a fighter, just like his sister." Sarah squeezed his shoulder gratefully before hurrying to table 5, where a young couple sat scrolling through their phones. They ordered without looking up at her, and Sarah wrote it all down with practiced efficiency. The morning rush hit at 9:30, office workers grabbing coffee, truck drivers stopping for breakfast, mothers with young children needing pancakes cut into tiny pieces. Sarah moved between tables in a dance she'd perfected over her 7 years at Mike's, refilling coffee cups, dropping off orders, collecting tips that she mentally assigned to various bills before they even hit her pocket. By noon, the diner had settled into its usual lull before the lunch crowd. Sarah was wiping down the counter when the door opened again, this time slowly. An old man she'd never seen before shuffled in, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His clothes were clean but worn thin, his gray hair neatly combed despite its need for a trim. Most noticeable, though, was the careful way he moved, as if each step required calculation. He chose a stool at the far end of the counter, setting his cane against it with deliberate movements. Sarah approached with a menu and her professional smile. "Welcome to Mike's. Can I get you something to drink while you look over the menu?" The old man looked up, and Sarah was struck by eyes so blue they seemed to belong to someone much younger. They crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Just coffee, please. Black." His voice was unexpectedly rich and clear. Sarah poured his coffee and continued her work, noticing how he simply sat there warming his hands around the mug, occasionally taking small sips as if making it last. An hour passed. The lunch rush came and went. The old man ordered nothing else, just asked for 1 refill of his coffee. When the diner emptied again, Sarah approached him with the pot. "Another refill?" He shook his head. "No, thank you. I should be going." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather coin purse, opening it carefully. Sarah watched as he counted out coins, his fingers slightly trembling. "That'll be $2.75, she said. The old man frowned slightly, counting again. "I seem to be a bit short," he finally admitted, his voice low with embarrassment. "I have $2.15. Without hesitation, Sarah waved her hand dismissively. Don't worry about it. It's just 60 cents. I can't accept that, the man said firmly, his dignity seemingly more important than his poverty. Think of it as your first-time customer discount, Sarah insisted with a smile. Maybe next time you'll try our apple pie, best in Portland. Something shifted in the old man's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or assessment. My name is James, he said suddenly, extending his hand. James Wilson. Sarah Miller, she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was stronger than she expected. Nice to meet you, Mr. Wilson. James, please. He studied her for a moment. You've been very kind, Sarah Miller. The comment, so simple yet direct, made Sarah uncomfortable with its sincerity. Just doing my job, she deflected. No, James said quietly. Kindness is never just doing a job. Before Sarah could respond, the door chimed and a group of teenagers piled in, loud and taking up space in the way that only teenagers can. By the time she'd seated them and taken their orders, James Wilson was gone. Only his empty coffee cup remained, and beneath it, exactly 60 cents in additional coins. Sarah pocketed the coins with a small smile and continued her shift. That evening, Sarah unlocked the door to the small two-bedroom apartment she shared with her brother. Tommy, I'm home. The living room was dark except for the blue glow of the television. Tommy sat wrapped in a blanket, his once athletic frame now thin and fragile. At 19, he should have been in college, playing baseball on scholarship as he'd planned. Instead, cancer had rewritten his story. Hey sis, he said, his smile genuine despite the exhaustion in his eyes. How was work? Same old, Sarah replied, setting down her purse and 2 bags of groceries. She didn't mention her aching feet or how she'd skipped lunch to save money. How are you feeling? Ready for the appointment? Tommy shrugged. As ready as I'll ever be. Sarah busied herself putting away groceries, carefully arranging items to hide how little she'd actually been able to afford. When she opened the refrigerator, Tommy spoke again. There's a letter from the hospital. On the table. Sarah's hand froze on the milk carton. She didn't need to look at the letter to know what it contained. Another bill. Another mountain they couldn't climb. We'll figure it out, she said, more to herself than to Tommy. We always do. Later, after Tommy had fallen asleep in his room, Sarah sat at their small kitchen table with papers spread before her. Bills, past due notices, a foreclosure warning on the apartment they rented, and the new hospital statement. The numbers blurred before her eyes as she calculated and recalculated, moving imaginary money from one column to another like a desperate magician. There wasn't enough. There was never enough. Sarah laid her head down on the table, allowing herself exactly 60 seconds of despair, the same amount she'd covered for James Wilson's coffee. 1 minute to feel the crushing weight, to acknowledge the fear that constantly simmered beneath her careful composure. Then, like always, she sat up, wiped her eyes, and started again. There had to be a solution. There always was, even if it meant taking a third job or selling the few valuables she had left. As she finally crawled into bed at midnight, Sarah thought briefly of the old man from the diner. There had been something in his eyes. A knowledge of struggle, perhaps, or an understanding of what it meant to count pennies. For a moment, she felt less alone. Tomorrow would be another early morning, another long day. But for tonight, Sarah allowed herself to drift into sleep with one comforting thought. She had helped someone today, even in the smallest way. In a world that had taken so much from her and Tommy, she could still give something. That had to count for something. What Sarah Miller couldn't know was just how much that simple act of kindness would end up counting. Not just 60 cents, but in ways that would soon change her life forever. The doctor's office was too cold. Sarah rubbed her arms as she sat in the hard plastic chair, watching Tommy flip through an outdated magazine without really seeing the pages. They had been waiting for 45 minutes already, but neither complained. When you can't afford your medical bills, you don't complain about the wait. Miller? A nurse in blue scrubs called from the doorway. "Dr. Patel will see you now." Sarah helped Tommy up, noticing how he leaned on her more than he had last week. His once strong arm felt thin under her hand. They followed the nurse down a hallway lined with medical posters showing organs and systems that Sarah couldn't pronounce the names of, but had learned to fear. Dr. Patel was a kind woman with tired eyes who had been Tommy's oncologist for the past year. She didn't waste time with small talk. "The last round of treatment hasn't been as effective as we hoped," she said, looking at the charts on her computer screen. "The cancer cells are still multiplying." Sarah felt Tommy's hand tighten in hers. "What's our next option?" she asked, the way she always did. There had to be a next option. There always was. Dr. Patel hesitated, which was new and terrifying. "There's an experimental treatment at Memorial Hospital downtown. It's showing promising results in cases like Tommy's." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. "Then that's what we'll do." "Sarah," Dr. Patel said gently, "I need to be clear. This treatment is expensive and not covered by insurance. We're talking about close to $200,000. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. Sarah couldn't breathe for a moment. "How long do I have without it?" Tommy asked quietly. Dr. Patel's face softened. "Months, maybe weeks. It's moving faster than we expected." The ride home was silent. Sarah gripped the steering wheel of her old Honda so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tommy stared out the window at the gray Portland sky. "Don't," Tommy finally said. "Don't what?" "Don't start thinking about how to get that kind of money. It's impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Sarah said automatically, though her mind was racing with useless calculations. Even if she worked double shifts every day, even if she sold everything they owned. "I'm tired of fighting," Tommy whispered, still looking out the window. "Maybe it's time to just—" "No," Sarah cut him off, her voice harder than she intended. "We're not giving up. I promised Mom I'd take care of you, and that's what I'm going to do." When they got home, Tommy went straight to his room. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator covered with medical appointment reminders and past due notices. For the first time in her adult life, she had no plan, no next step. The next morning at the diner, Sarah moved through her shift like a sleepwalker. She took orders, delivered food, refilled coffee cups, all without really seeing the people in front of her. Her mind kept repeating Dr. Patel's words and that impossible number, $200,000. "You're 1,000,000 miles away today." The voice startled her. Sarah looked up to find James Wilson sitting at the counter, those remarkable blue eyes studying her with concern. She hadn't even noticed him come in. "Oh, Mr. Wilson, James, sorry about that. Coffee?" "Please," he said, watching as she poured. "Something's troubling you." It wasn't a question. Sarah found herself unable to brush it off with her usual, "I'm fine," response. "Just some family stuff," she said instead. "Your brother?" James asked. Sarah froze. "How did you know about my brother?" James smiled gently. "You mentioned him yesterday when that fellow at the counter asked about him. Tommy, right?" "Right," Sarah said, relaxing slightly. Of course she had mentioned Tommy to Nathan. "He's sick. Cancer." "I'm very sorry to hear that," James said, and unlike most people who said those words, he sounded like he truly meant it. "Is there anything I can do?" Sarah almost laughed. "Unless you have a spare $200,000 lying around, I don't think so." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." "Not at all," James replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Medical care in this country is disgracefully expensive." Sarah expected that to be the end of the conversation, but James Wilson kept coming back to the diner. Every day for the next 2 weeks, he would arrive at exactly 2:30 p.m., order a black coffee and sometimes a slice of apple pie, and stay for precisely 1 hour. Sometimes they chatted. Sometimes he simply sat quietly, watching the diner with those observant blue eyes. He always paid in exact change now, never short like that first day. Meanwhile, Sarah's life was falling apart. The hospital started calling daily about unpaid bills. The landlord left a final notice on their door: pay in full by the end of the month or face eviction. She picked up extra shifts at a nearby convenience store, sleeping only 4 hours a night and still barely making ends meet. Then came the day when everything collapsed at once. It started with Tommy fainting in the shower. Sarah had to call an ambulance, another expense they couldn't afford, and miss her shift at the diner. Frank wasn't happy. "Third time this month, Sarah," he said over the phone. "I get that you've got problems, but I've got a business to run." "I know, Frank. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "You're right. It won't," Frank said with a sigh. "I gotta let you go, Sarah. I'll mail your final check." Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room, clutching her silent phone. No job, no income, no home soon. And now, no brother? The thought made her sick with fear. Hours later, Dr. Patel found her still sitting there. "He's stable," she said, sitting beside Sarah. "But this episode is concerning. The cancer is affecting his overall strength now. Without treatment—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Sarah nodded numbly. "Can I see him?" Tommy was asleep, his face pale against the white hospital pillow. Sarah sat beside him, holding his hand, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. She had never felt so helpless in her life. When visiting hours ended, she walked out into the cold night air without any clear idea of where to go. Home felt pointless. It wouldn't be their home much longer anyway. Without thinking, her feet carried her toward Mike's diner. Even though she no longer worked there, it had been her sanctuary for 7 years. The diner was closed, the windows dark. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, shivering without a proper coat, staring at her reflection in the glass. What now? Where does a person go when there are no options left? "Sarah?" She turned to find James Wilson standing a few feet away, leaning on his cane. He wasn't wearing a coat either, just his usual worn sweater. "James, what are you doing here so late?" "I might ask you the same question," he replied, moving closer. "Especially since you weren't at work today." "I don't work here anymore," Sarah said flatly. "I got fired." James frowned. "Because of your brother?" Sarah nodded, too exhausted to cry. "He collapsed this morning. He's in the hospital again." The old man was quiet for a moment. "Will you walk with me, Sarah? There's a park just around the corner." It was an odd request at nearly 10 o'clock at night, but Sarah had nothing to lose. She fell into step beside him, matching his slower pace. The small park was empty, lit only by a few street lamps. They sat on a bench facing a children's playground. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Sarah," James said after a while. Sarah looked at him warily. "What do you mean?" "I didn't come to that diner by accident. I came looking for you." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Sarah's spine. "I don't understand." James turned to face her fully. "I work for someone. A man with considerable resources who prefers to remain anonymous. He's looking for a particular kind of person, and I believe you might be who he's searching for." Sarah stood up quickly. "Look, I don't know what this is, but—" "Please," James said, raising a hand. "Let me finish. This isn't what you're thinking. My employer is elderly and without heirs. He wants his fortune to go to someone deserving, someone with true kindness and integrity, someone like you." Sarah stared at him. "This is crazy. You don't even know me." "But I do," James said softly. "I've been watching you for weeks. How you treat people, how you put everyone else first, how you've sacrificed everything for your brother. So what, this is some kind of test? See if the poor waitress is nice enough to get some handout?" James shook his head. "Not a handout. An opportunity. My employer doesn't give charity. He makes investments in people he believes in." Sarah sat back down, suddenly dizzy. "What kind of opportunity?" A job to start, with housing included, and medical benefits that would cover Tommy's treatments. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. What's the catch? The catch, James said carefully, is that you'd have to leave Portland. The position is in Seattle, and you'd have to start immediately. I can't just leave. Tommy's in the hospital. Arrangements can be made to transfer him to a facility in Seattle, all expenses paid. Sarah's mind raced. Was this really happening? Or had she fallen asleep in the hospital chair and was dreaming this whole bizarre conversation? Who is this person? Why me? Why now? James smiled gently. My employer values his privacy. As for why you, I've already explained that. And as for why now, he paused. Sometimes help arrives precisely when we need it most. Sarah thought of Tommy lying in that hospital bed, of the eviction notice, of her empty bank account. What choice did she really have? What would I have to do? She asked finally. Come meet him tomorrow morning. If you don't like what he has to say, you can walk away and we'll never bother you again. Sarah looked at the old man's face, searching for signs of deception. She found none. Okay, she said quietly. I'll meet him. James nodded, his blue eyes twinkling in the dim light. Excellent. A car will pick you up at your apartment at 9 a.m. He stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. Get some rest, Sarah Miller. Tomorrow might change your life. As she watched him walk away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the park lights, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made either the smartest or the stupidest decision of her life, and she couldn't tell which. Sarah barely slept that night. She sat by her kitchen window, watching the streetlights flicker as questions tumbled through her mind. Who was James Wilson, really? Who was this mysterious employer? Was this some elaborate scam? By the time the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, she had convinced herself a dozen times to refuse the strange offer, only to change her mind again when she thought of Tommy. At 8:30, she called the hospital. Tommy was stable but still sleeping. She told the nurse she might be unreachable for a few hours but would check in again by noon. At exactly 9 a.m., a sleek black car pulled up in front of her apartment building. The driver, a woman in a simple black suit, opened the door for Sarah. Ms. Miller, she said politely, my name is Diana. I'll be taking you to meet Mr. Edwards today. Edwards? Sarah repeated. Is that James's employer? Diana just smiled. All your questions will be answered soon. The car moved smoothly through Portland's morning traffic. Sarah noticed they were heading away from downtown, toward the hills where the city's wealthiest residents lived. After about 20 minutes, they turned onto a private road that wound through tall pine trees. At the end stood a modest but elegant house, not the mansion Sarah had expected. Diana parked and opened Sarah's door. This way, please. The house was beautiful inside. Warm wood floors, large windows overlooking a garden. Simple but obviously expensive furniture. It felt lived in and comfortable, not showy. Mr. Edwards will join you shortly, Diana said, leading Sarah to a sunlit sitting room. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? I'm fine, thank you, Sarah replied, too nervous to drink anything. Diana nodded and left. Sarah stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, unsure whether to sit. She was examining a painting on the wall, a simple landscape that somehow captured exactly how morning light looks on a meadow, when a door opened behind her. It's a wonderful piece, isn't it? The artist was completely unknown when I bought it 30 years ago. Sarah turned quickly. An elderly man in a wheelchair had entered the room. He was thin but distinguished looking, with silver hair and sharp eyes. What struck Sarah most was that he looked nothing like James Wilson. This man was clearly wealthy, from his tailored clothes to his manicured hands. Hello, Ms. Miller. I'm Robert Edwards. His voice was warm and cultured. Please, have a seat. Sarah sat on the edge of the sofa across from his wheelchair. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Edwards. James, Mr. Wilson said you might have a job opportunity. Edwards smiled slightly. James has a tendency to simplify things. What I'm offering is both more and less than a job. He studied her face for a moment. Tell me, Ms. Miller, what do you know about me? Nothing, sir. Exactly. And yet you came here based solely on the word of a man you met 2 weeks ago. Why? The question caught Sarah off guard. I guess I didn't have much to lose. Edwards nodded. Desperation can be a powerful motivator, but it can also cloud judgment. He wheeled himself closer to her. Your brother has leukemia. You lost your job yesterday. You're about to be evicted from your apartment. And you need $200,000 for an experimental treatment that might save Tommy's life. Sarah stiffened. How do you know all that? Information is a commodity I trade in, Ms. Miller. I make it my business to know the people I'm interested in. And why exactly are you interested in me? Sarah asked, growing increasingly uncomfortable. Edwards smiled. Because James believes you're special, and James is rarely wrong. He moved his wheelchair back slightly. Let me tell you a story. 40 years ago, I was a young businessman with a brilliant idea but no funding. Every bank in town rejected me. Then one day, a stranger overheard me talking in a coffee shop and offered to invest. That money built Edwards Technologies, which I sold 10 years ago for just over $1 billion. Sarah tried not to show her shock at the number. That stranger changed my life, Edwards continued, and when I asked him why he'd taken such a risk on me, he said something I never forgot. True wealth is measured by what we give, not what we keep. He paused, watching Sarah's reaction. I'm dying, Ms. Miller. Cancer, ironically enough. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe less. I have no children, no family at all. My entire fortune, close to $800 million after taxes and charitable donations, needs a home. Sarah's mouth went dry. Mr. Edwards, I don't understand what this has to do with me. I'm looking for someone to leave my fortune to, he said simply. Someone who will use it wisely and compassionately. James has been helping me find that person. Sarah almost laughed. And he picked a waitress from Mike's diner? He picked someone who gave 60 cents to a stranger when she could barely afford her own bills. Someone who works 3 jobs to care for her sick brother. Someone who treats people with dignity regardless of their station in life. Edwards leaned forward. Money doesn't create character, Ms. Miller. It reveals it. I want my legacy in the hands of someone whose character I trust. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. This is crazy. You don't even know me. That's why you're here today, to begin the process of getting to know each other. Edwards checked his watch. In fact, our first appointment is in 30 minutes. Appointment? Yes, I hope you don't mind, but I've arranged for us to visit a place that's very important to me. Before Sarah could respond, Diana appeared at the door. The car is ready, sir. Edwards nodded. Shall we, Ms. Miller? Unless you'd prefer to leave now, you're under no obligation to continue. Sarah thought of Tommy in the hospital, of the unpaid bills, of her empty refrigerator. I'll come. 20 minutes later, the car stopped in front of a simple building in a working-class neighborhood. A sign above the door read, East Side Community Center. Diana helped Edwards into a different wheelchair, this one motorized, and they went inside. Sarah followed, not knowing what to expect. The center was bustling with activity. In one room, young children were engaged in what looked like an art class. In another, teenagers hunched over computers while an instructor moved between them. I founded this center 15 years ago, Edwards explained as they moved down the hall. We provide after-school programs, job training, English classes for immigrants, and much more. It costs about $4 million a year to run, all of which comes from my foundation. He led Sarah into a large room where about 20 children, ranging from around 8 to 12 years old, sat at tables working intently on what appeared to be science projects. This is our Young Scientists program, Edwards said proudly. Many of these children come from schools with inadequate science education. Here, They get hands-on experience with real scientists. A young girl looked up from her project and broke into a wide smile. "Mr. Edwards," she called, running over to his wheelchair. "I did it. The bridge held twice the weight." "Wonderful work, Maya," Edwards said warmly. "I knew you could solve the structural problem." The girl noticed Sarah and looked at her curiously. "Maya, this is Ms. Miller," Edwards said. "Ms. Miller, meet Maya Washington, future engineer." "Nice to meet you, Maya," Sarah said, genuinely impressed by the girl's enthusiasm. "Are you a scientist too?" Maya asked. Sarah smiled. "No, just a waitress." "My mom's a waitress," Maya said matter-of-factly. "She works really hard." "Indeed she does," Edwards agreed. "Maya's mother works 2 jobs to support her family. But Maya here is on track for a scholarship to a science-focused high school next year." They spent the next hour touring the center. Sarah met dedicated teachers, eager students, and staff who clearly adored Edwards. The impact of his funding was evident everywhere, from the well-equipped classrooms to the healthy snacks provided to all students. Finally, they ended up in a small office. Edwards dismissed Diana, asking her to return in an hour. "What do you think of the center, Ms. Miller?" he asked once they were alone. "It's amazing," Sarah said honestly. "You're changing so many lives." Edwards nodded. "That's the real power of wealth, not what it buys, but what it builds." He wheeled himself behind the desk and opened a drawer. "Now, I need to explain something important." He placed 2 envelopes on the desk. Inside these envelopes are 2 options. In one, there is a check for $10 million made out to you personally. In the other, there is a document guaranteeing funding for this center for the next 20 years. Sarah stared at the envelopes. "I'm going to ask you to choose one," Edwards continued. "If you choose the money, it's yours with no strings attached. You can pay for Tommy's treatment, buy a house, never work again if you don't want to. If you choose the center, you'll leave here with nothing for yourself, but knowing you've secured the future for hundreds of children like Maya." "This is a test," Sarah said slowly, understanding dawning. "Yes," Edwards admitted. "The first of several. I told you, I need to know the person who will inherit my fortune." Sarah looked at the envelopes. $10 million would change her life completely. It would save Tommy. It would solve every financial problem she'd ever had. But then she thought of Maya's excited face, of the teenagers learning skills that might lift them out of poverty, of the immigrant adults studying English to improve their job prospects. "How many students come through this center each year?" she asked. "About 500, Edwards replied. "Why? And you said it costs $4 million a year to run?" "Yes." Sarah did the math in her head. "So that's $8,000 per student per year. For 20 years, that's $80,000 per student." "Roughly, yes." Sarah thought of Tommy again. The experimental treatment might not even work. But for these kids, this center definitely worked. 500 kids a year for 20 years. 10,000 lives changed. She reached for the envelope on the right. "This one," she said quietly. Edwards watched her carefully. "You understand what you're giving up?" Sarah nodded. "I do. May I ask why you chose as you did?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Because one person's comfort doesn't outweigh 10,000 futures, even if that person is someone I love." Edwards was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real, warm smile that transformed his formal demeanor. "Open the envelope, Ms. Miller." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she tore open the envelope. Inside was not a document about the center at all, but a letter. She read it quickly, her eyes widening. "I don't understand," she whispered. "It's quite simple," Edward said, his eyes twinkling. Both envelopes contained the same thing, a letter explaining that this was never a real choice. "The center's funding is already secured in perpetuity through my foundation. No matter which envelope you chose, you would have received this letter." "Then what was the point?" Sarah asked, confused. "The point, my dear, was to see what choice you would make when faced with an impossible decision. And you chose exactly as James said you would. Edwards reached across the desk and took her hand. There is something else you should know. Your brother Tommy has already been transferred to Seattle's Memorial Hospital, where he was admitted to their experimental treatment program this morning. Sarah gasped. What? How? I made a call, Edwards said simply. Whether or not you choose to continue our discussions about my inheritance, Tommy's treatment is taken care of. I'm not a monster, Ms. Miller. I wouldn't use a young man's life as a bargaining chip. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Why are you doing all this? She whispered. Edward's face grew serious. Because I believe that wealth without purpose is meaningless, and I believe that you, Sarah Miller, understand that better than most people with far more advantages. He held her gaze steadily. The question now is, are you willing to continue this journey? To learn what it would mean to manage great wealth and great responsibility? It won't be easy. There will be more tests, more difficult choices. Sarah thought about everything she had seen today, about Tommy getting the treatment he needed, about Maya and her bridge design. Yes, she said firmly. I want to continue. Edwards nodded, looking pleased but not surprised. Good, then we begin tomorrow. He pressed a button on his wheelchair, and Diana appeared almost immediately. Please take Ms. Miller to see her brother at Memorial, and then to the apartment we've prepared for her. As Sarah stood to leave, Edwards held up a hand. One last thing, Ms. Miller. Have you wondered why you haven't seen James Wilson today? The question caught Sarah by surprise. In all the excitement, she hadn't thought about James's absence. I assumed he was busy. Edwards smiled mysteriously. Indeed. But I think you'll see him again soon enough. As the car pulled away from the community center, Sarah watched Edwards through the window. For a man who claimed to be dying, he looked remarkably strong, and there was something familiar about his eyes that she couldn't quite place, something that reminded her of someone else. Only when they were halfway to the hospital did it hit her. Those sharp, knowing blue eyes. They were exactly like James Wilson's. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur for Sarah. Each morning, a car would pick her up from the comfortable apartment that had been arranged for her. She would spend a few hours with Tommy at the hospital, where he was already showing signs of improvement under the new treatment. Then she would be taken to various locations across Seattle to meet with Edwards. One day they visited a homeless shelter funded by his foundation. Another day, they toured a medical research facility working on affordable treatments for childhood diseases. Sometimes they simply sat in Edwards's home office, where he patiently explained the complexities of managing great wealth, investments, taxes, charitable giving, and the responsibility that came with having resources others needed. Through it all, Sarah noticed two things. First, despite claiming to be dying, Edwards never showed signs of illness or fatigue. And second, James Wilson never reappeared. When she asked about him, Edwards always changed the subject. On the 15th day, Sarah arrived at Edwards's house to find him looking more serious than usual. Today is different, Ms. Miller, he said as soon as she entered his office. Today is your final test. Sarah sat down across from him, her stomach tightening with nervous anticipation. I'm ready. Edwards nodded. During these past 2 weeks, you've seen how I use my wealth. You've met the people whose lives have been changed by it. You've begun to understand the responsibility involved. Yes, Sarah agreed. It's been eye-opening. Good, because today I need to know if you're truly prepared for what accepting my inheritance would mean. Edwards wheeled himself to the window, looking out at the garden. My money comes with strings attached, Ms. Miller, significant ones. What kind of strings? Edwards turned back to face her. If you inherit my fortune, you must commit to continuing my work exactly as I have designed it. Every program, every foundation, every initiative must remain funded at current levels. You would be the caretaker of my legacy, not the creator of your own. Sarah frowned slightly. I thought the point was for me to use the money wisely based on my own judgment. That's what I wanted you to think, Edwards said coolly. The truth is, I need someone who will follow my exact instructions, not deviate with their own ideas, however well-intentioned. Something felt wrong about this conversation. The Edwards she had come to know over the past 2 weeks didn't speak this way, didn't treat people like puppets to be controlled. "What about my brother?" she asked carefully. "Would I be allowed to use some of the money for his ongoing care?" Edwards shrugged. "A small allowance would be permitted for personal matters, but the bulk, over 95% of the fortune, would be locked into my existing plans." Sarah stood up slowly. "Mr. Edwards, I'm grateful for everything you've done for Tommy and me. But this doesn't sound like the opportunity you initially described. It sounds more like you're hiring a glorified assistant to carry out your orders after you're gone." "And that's a problem for you?" Edwards asked, his eyes narrowing. Most people would happily accept such restrictions in exchange for living comfortably for the rest of their lives. "I'm not most people," Sarah said simply. "I believe that true giving comes from the heart, not from following a script written by someone else. If I were entrusted with resources to help others, I would need the freedom to respond to needs as they arose, not stick rigidly to a plan that might become outdated." She took a deep breath. "Thank you for the opportunity, but I don't think I'm the right person for this role." To her surprise, Edwards smiled, a wide, genuine smile that transformed his face. "And that, Ms. Miller, was your final test, one which you passed with flying colors." Sarah blinked in confusion. "I don't understand." "I have no intention of controlling my fortune from the grave," Edwards explained, his voice warmer now. "I wanted to see if you would stand up for your own principles, even at the risk of losing everything I've offered you." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened behind her. She turned and froze in shock. James Wilson stood in the doorway, not the James Wilson she had known from the diner. No cane, no stooped shoulders, no worn clothes. This James Wilson stood tall and strong, dressed in an expensive suit that matched the one Edwards wore. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his blue eyes twinkling with the same light she had seen at the diner. Sarah looked back and forth between the two men, understanding slowly dawning. "You're the same person," she whispered. Edwards, or James, nodded. "Robert Edwards and James Wilson are both me. One is my true identity, and one was a character I created." "But why?" Sarah asked, struggling to process this revelation. "Why the deception?" "Because true character is revealed when we think no one is watching," Edwards said, standing up from his wheelchair. "If I had approached you as a billionaire looking for an heir, you would have shown me what you thought I wanted to see. As James, a seemingly poor old man, I could observe who you really are." Sarah sank back into her chair, her mind racing. "The coffee at the diner, being 60 cents short, that was all planned?" "A small test," Edwards admitted, "but a revealing one. Most people show their true character in small moments, not grand gestures." "And the wheelchair? Your illness?" Edwards walked around the desk, moving easily. "More tests. I needed to know if you would treat a disabled person with the same respect as anyone else. As for my illness, that was part of the story to explain my search for an heir." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "So everything has been a lie?" "Not everything," Edwards said gently. "The community center is real. The children there are real. Tommy's treatment is real. And most importantly, my intention to leave you my fortune is very real." He sat in the chair beside her. "Sarah, I've spent my life building wealth. In the process, I've learned that money is a powerful tool, but also a dangerous one. It can corrupt even the best intentions. I needed to be absolutely certain that whoever inherited my fortune would use it wisely and compassionately." "So, what happens now?" Sarah asked. Edward smiled. "Now, if you're still willing, we begin the real work, teaching you how to manage wealth not as a burden or a blessing, but as a responsibility. No strings attached except those you choose to accept." Sarah thought about everything that had happened over the past month, losing her job, nearly losing Tommy, meeting James Edwards, the tests she'd faced. It felt like a dream, yet here she was. "I have one condition," she said finally. Edwards raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" "I want to keep working. Not at the diner necessarily, but somewhere. I don't want to become someone who only writes checks but never gets her hands dirty." Edwards nodded approvingly. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next 6 months were the most extraordinary of Sarah's life. Tommy completed his treatment successfully, with doctors calling his recovery remarkable. Sarah moved them both into a modest house near the hospital. Not the mansion she could have afforded, but a comfortable home with a garden where Tommy could regain his strength. Edwards proved to be a patient teacher. 3 days a week, Sarah worked alongside him, learning the intricacies of managing his vast holdings. The other 2 days, at her insistence, she volunteered at a local hospital, serving coffee and comfort to families of cancer patients. On a bright spring morning, almost exactly a year after Sarah had covered James Wilson's 60-cent shortage at the diner, she sat across from Edwards in his office for what would be their last meeting. "The papers are all signed," Edwards said, closing a thick folder. "Upon my death, everything transfers to you through the trust we've established." "I still can't believe this is real," Sarah admitted. Edwards smiled. "It's very real. And speaking of reality, there's something I need to tell you." He paused. "My doctors called yesterday. The cancer is no longer in remission." Sarah felt her heart sink. Over the past months, she had come to care deeply for this complicated man. "How long?" she asked quietly. "A few months, perhaps less." Edwards looked remarkably calm. "Which means your real work is about to begin." "I won't let you down," Sarah promised. "I know you won't." Edwards reached across the desk and took her hand. "You know, when I started this search, I thought I was looking for someone to continue my legacy. What I didn't expect was to find someone who would become part of it." 3 months later, Sarah stood beside Edwards's hospital bed. Despite the best medical care money could buy, his body was failing rapidly. Tommy was there too, healthy and strong again, holding the other side of Edwards's hand. "Remember," Edwards whispered, his once strong voice now faint, "the money is just a tool. It's your heart that will guide how you use it." "I'll remember," Sarah promised, tears streaming down her face. Edwards smiled weakly. "I have a confession to make." "What's that?" "That first day at the diner, I really was short 60 cents. I hadn't planned that test at all." Sarah laughed through her tears. "You mean the one thing I thought was a setup was actually real?" "Life's funny that way," Edwards murmured. His blue eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, held hers. "You passed a test I hadn't even meant to give." He died peacefully in his sleep that night. The newspaper headlines the next day announced, "Billionaire Robert Edwards passes away at 78. Fortune goes to former waitress." What the headlines didn't mention was the letter Edwards had left for Sarah, which she read alone in the quiet of her new office, his old office. "Dear Sarah," it said, "by now you know that wealth is both a gift and a burden. Use it wisely. Give generously. Live simply. And always remember that the most important things in life, kindness, integrity, love, cost nothing at all. These are the true inheritance I leave you. The money is just details." 1 year later, Sarah opened the doors to the first of 12 new community centers across the country, modeled after Edwards' original. She called them 60-cent centers, a name that made most people scratch their heads in confusion. But Tommy understood. So did Diana, who now worked as Sarah's assistant. And so did Maya, the young engineer from the original center, who was now attending college on a full scholarship from the Edwards Miller Foundation. Standing at the ribbon-cutting ceremony with Tommy healthy beside her, Sarah thought about how a simple cup of coffee and 60 cents had changed her life forever. But more than that, she thought about how true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched, the kindness you showed, and the legacy you built. one small act at a time. What she couldn't have known was that among the crowd attending the opening, a young woman watched her with curious eyes. A woman who, like Sarah a year before, was working 3 jobs to support a sick parent, barely making ends meet, and losing hope. And Sarah couldn't have known that the next morning this young woman would be startled when a kind older woman with warm brown eyes came into the cafe where she worked and ordered a black coffee. Or that this older woman would happen to be exactly 60 cents short.